Okay, can everybody take their seats, please? The last session of the afternoon is about to begin. This is a back-to-back session, 2 roundtables. Roundtable 2 is our first one. It's entitled Upholding UK Responsibilities to Protect in Xinjiang. What does this mean in policy terms? Okay, can everybody take their seats, please? Runa, Marie, sit down, please. It's not working. Can you sit down? Thank you. Wonderful. Okay. So I'm delighted to welcome our chair, Tatiana Eatwell, who is a barrister. She will be looking after us for the next hour and 15. Thank you, Tatiana.
Hello, everyone. I assume this mic is on, yeah. Okay. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be chairing this roundtable this afternoon with some very distinguished panelists today. As Joe just introduced, this roundtable will be discussing the topic of upholding UK responsibilities to protect in Xinjiang. What does this mean in policy terms? And to introduce the topic, I'd just like to say thank you to all the contributors to this conference so far. We've heard a lot about the background and the evidential basis for saying that there may be a genocide being committed in Xinjiang, or at least crimes against humanity and other serious and grave violations of international human rights law. And certainly this topic has been discussed in our Parliament, and notably on the 12th of January of this year, with respect to debate concerning an amendment to the UK trade bill at the time, and which got labelled the Genocide Amendment. And with respect to that topic, the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, outlined, gave a summary of the atrocities and human rights violations being committed against the Uyghur in Xinjiang, as the UK government understands it to be. And in conclusion to that, the Foreign Secretary said, we have a moral obligation to act. Well, that's right, but it's also not exactly right, because also the UK has a legal obligation to act. And there is some misunderstanding, and I'm grateful to the contributors in the panel previously. There's a clear misunderstanding from the Foreign Secretary and indeed our own Prime Minister as to what the UK's international legal obligations are under the Convention to Prevent and Punish Genocide. And I'm speaking specifically about the obligation to prevent. As several of our speakers have said today, and I remind you of the keynote speaker, Shona Jolly QC, as she said in her talk, the obligation to prevent genocide is triggered the moment the state learns of the serious risk of genocide being committed. And so the response that it is a requirement for there to be proof that genocide is being committed before the UK must act is wrong. It's not correct. The obligation is to act the moment there is a serious risk of genocide being committed, and that ought to be the question being asked. Once genocide is determined by a court or tribunal or a state government who recognises it as such, the state that has failed to do anything is in violation of its obligation. And that's why governments don't want to point out if certain situations constitute genocide, because then they are admitting, if they have not taken steps, that they are in breach of their own international obligations. With that in mind, I am very privileged to introduce the panel today. In order of appearance, we have TUGENDHAT MP for Tonbridge and Malling, who is chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, who is appearing by video link and just waved his hand to you all. Welcome. Followed by Nusrat GHANI MP for Wealden, who is member of the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Committee. Her committee produced a report in March of this year on Uyghur forced labour in Xinjiang and UK value chains. Followed by Dr. Kate Ferguson, who is Co-Executive Director and Head of Research and Policy at Protection approaches, and has previously worked as a foreign policy consultant and political advisor regarding atrocity prevention in the UK, Rwanda, and the Ukraine. And after Dr. Ferguson, we'll be hearing from Dr. Sophie Richardson, who is the China Director at Human Rights Watch, who is also waving from the screen and appearing with us via video link today. And last but not least, we will be hearing from KINNOCK MP for Aberfan, who is the Shadow Minister for Asia and Pacific. So to our panel members, you have 5 to 8 minutes to speak. It would be great to keep it to time. I've been told that we are strictly keeping to time today. And I will be giving you a tap, a nod, or a cough when you have 2 minutes to go. And this topic we're specifically going to discuss, or I'm hoping that we will discuss, is the recommendations of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee report regarding atrocity prevention, and the recommendation to the UK government that it needs to develop and implement an atrocity prevention strategy. So with that in mind, I now hand over to Tom TUGENDHAT MP for his preliminary remarks.
Good afternoon. Forgive me, it wouldn't be a Zoom moment, would it, unless somebody was faffing around with the mute button, so I apologise for that. Look, it's a huge pleasure to be with you this afternoon. This is an enormously important topic, and I've got to be honest with you, I'm somewhat of an interloper here on this panel, because the real hard work for this has been done by Nusrat GHANI, who is significantly more capable of speaking on this question than I am. I was privileged to chair the Foreign Affairs Committee that heard a lot of evidence and brought out various suggestions and recommendations. But really, I'm going to be listening to Nuz, and I hope you will be too, because she's rather more impressive on the subject than I am. Let me just say where we started as a committee. We didn't start, as many have, quite understandably, on looking at Xinjiang and seeing what we can do there. What we looked at is how this affects the United Kingdom and what actions British business and British people can take in order not just to protect ourselves from possible complicity in slave-made goods and other forms of abuse, but also what the government can do to make sure that British businesses are protected against both being complicit in that exploitation, but also competition, unfair competition, because of course, you know, slavery is not only an incredible wrong to the individual, of course, and the abuse is not only an incredible wrong to the individual, but it creates unfair competitive practices. And I think both of these are ways in which we need to tackle it. So for us, the recommendation was really not just to look at it as a Foreign Office matter. That doesn't mean that embassies don't have an important role. Of course they do. But it's not just a Foreign Office matter. It's also BEIS. It's also, because of the business element, it's also science because of the ability to trace goods, whether that's tracing the origin of cotton or indeed tomato sauces and various other products that have been connected to such abuses. And it's also organizations like the Justice Department, which of course has the legal expertise to bring potential action against individuals who may be connected to such abuses when they travel to a jurisdiction where we could exercise some weight. So our recommendation was very much to see that all of those should be brought together, and we should look at having senior members as designated atrocity prevention leads. And the newly announced conflict centre could, or rather should, coordinate all of these actions, multilateral actions, applications to international law, sanctions, intelligence gathering, aid programming, and indeed much more. And we also said that the government should provide atrocity prevention toolkits and training for FCDO staff with refresher courses at regular intervals. We said 3 years. If you come to us with an argument that actually 4 is fine or 2 is better, then I'd be very happy to listen to that as well. But the idea being that actually the reality is atrocities, the nature of atrocities does change. It changes because the way that states organize and states hide changes, the way that firms employ or deploy abused labor evolves with time, and so we do need to make sure that our staff are updated. And we should also implement early warning systems, specifically focused on predicting mass atrocities and mainstream non-conflict atrocity prevention thinking. Because this is, frankly, this isn't just about the abuse. This is about the build-up to the abuse. This is about the eyes and ears that we have. And you know, I don't want to get into a debate about the structure of the UK government, but one of the realities that we now have is that DFID and the Foreign Office are now part of the same organisation, as you know, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, which means that actually, in many ways, the FCO, the Foreign Office element, has even greater reach into many parts and many communities than it did before, because that connection, that ability to hear from aid workers, individuals, people who are working with communities around the world on the ground, gives us an opening to understand better the context in which abuses happen. Now, we also recommended that the government should appoint a special envoy on atrocity prevention to ensure that the prevention of mass atrocities is consistently championed across Parliament and government. Now, this is particularly important because one of the things that I am conscious of, and I know others are, is that we don't want to be seen to be picking winners or rather picking losers. This is a standard that we need to hold everyone to, including ourselves, not just one in which we use to target a particular nation state or organization. So I'm very keen that that recommendation goes through as well. Now, the last point is we think that we need to fund more work. Now, many of you will have seen reports like the ASPI report, the Australian Strategic Projects Initiative, which was absolutely fantastic in exposing the cotton of Xinjiang and the abuses that went with it. That was, in part, funded by our Foreign Office, and I think that was an extremely important use of support. And I'm very glad that they did it. But there is actually a lot more to do. And this isn't just about Xinjiang. This is also about countries like Burma. It's also about countries in many other parts of the world. And so having a more regular flow of study and a greater level of academic as well as practical understanding, I think is essential to making sure that we do our bit in stamping this out. Now, I've been told 5 minutes. I think that is 5. I'm going to stop there, and I'm mostly looking forward to hearing from those.
5 minutes and 51 seconds. So you've done very well. Hurrah! And on that note, to Nusrat GHANI, thank you very much.
Thank you. Tom took up 51 seconds of my speaking time, I want to note for the record. And well, thank you so much. Well, first of all, I'm incredibly grateful for Joe for convening this conference. I know it's been incredibly difficult. What is the word? It's like getting cats going in one direction. There must be a term for this.
Herding cats.
Herding cats, getting parliamentarians to come here. So it's fantastic to follow on from Tom and the tremendous work he's done on this issue, but also on Afghanistan as well. He's a neighbour of mine in the constituency, so I'm very lucky to have him so close to home, as well as working on issues such as dealing with the Uyghur crisis as well. I know that 2 other of my fellow sanctioned MPs, along with Tom, Tim Loughton and Sir N. Duncan Smith, are on their way here or are watching via Zoom, and this is all down to the huge amount of respect we have for Jo and all the work that she has done. So we are incredibly grateful for you for holding this conference, and I only apologise that my other 2 colleagues can't be here with you today, but they're most definitely on their way. Tom was very, very lovely in proposing his listening to me, but Tom, like the rest of you in this room, are absolute experts, and I'm a far more simple parliamentarian that uses far more simple language, so I'll just cut to the chase. I was sanctioned along with Tom for the work that we both did on our select committees. I produced a report on business supply chains. I'm just going to hold the report up here for the Business Select Committee. And basically, it was a way to showcase that we have a 2-tier system in the world. We have a number of national and international laws that apply to businesses, but unfortunately, they don't seem to apply to China. And we wanted to showcase this situation and also try and encourage the government and also European governments and the United States how we can work together to ensure that the rules and laws and values that we have are translated into our business in China, not just the rest of the world. I also must reflect on the work that we did on the Genocide Amendment. I led on that with Lord Alton, and even though we weren't ultimately successful, the government did offer a compromise, which means those individuals that feel they are being forced or their families in a country overseas are facing genocide, they can come forward and make presentations to the government. So we are not involved in trade deals with countries complicit in genocide. Unfortunately, the government's version of the amendment didn't fit our requirements because it deliberately excludes the Uyghur people and China. So that campaign continues to grow, but it does show that we did get a minor win. And the next thing I'm going to say may upset a few people in the room and may deem to be controversial, but I also moved a motion in the UK Parliament with great support from colleagues across the House, including Tom and Stephen, which was, does the UK Parliament think that the 5 measures of genocide are being met in Xinjiang by the hands of the Chinese? And I know many people today have been discussing the legal term, but I was able to produce the facts that many people in this room have put together, and the UK Parliament, on hearing the motion, did unanimously agree that they believe a genocide is taking place, which then answers the question, how and when did the government have the knowledge that they felt that people were at risk of genocide? I'm just going to read the motion out because I know that some people here, especially with a legal background, were uncomfortable that this motion went through. And the motion was that this House believes that Uyghurs and other ethnic religious minorities in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region are suffering crimes against humanity and genocide, and calls on the government to act to fulfill its obligations under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide and all relevant instruments of international law to bring it to an end. What's important to remember that nobody challenged the motion. The motion went through 100% because nobody had an argument against the evidence that we were presenting on all 5 markers of genocide. And a lot of that work is done by the experts in this room that we then translate into an easy language in Parliament and for the public. We've had a number of European parliaments now move that motion as well. So there is a tremendous amount of movement, but Tom and I and everybody else on the panel will probably argue we have so much further to go when it comes to legislation. I'm just going to focus on some of the recommendations in the Select Committee report, which also reflect on the work that Tom has been doing. So basically, you know, we have a number of rules and laws that say that supply chains have to be clean. And my major recommendation is that we need to produce a black and white list when it comes to any companies having links back to factories in Xinjiang. And the burden of proof was on those factories to prove that those companies to prove that their supply chains were clean. And you would argue that's quite a simple recommendation because most companies now, especially those that operate in Europe and America, have to show transparency in their supply chains to try and understand the impact on the environment so they can try and make sure that they are balancing that out with alternative policies. But unfortunately, when it comes to Xinjiang, this isn't taking place, nor can it take place because people aren't able to go in and do any basic checks. We've recently had some evidence that those individuals that were sent in by international firms to do some checks were then arrested and interrogated at length by the Chinese state. But this part of the report was absolutely key to me being sanctioned because it meant a number of large companies that came and gave evidence to the Select Committee were then asking questions back in China of their regional managers and also asking to see what was happening in those factories and fundamentally trying to remove their supply chains out of Xinjiang to other parts of China. And that movement by business, and business always moves much faster and deeper than government, led to a number of us being sanctioned. And I hope those businesses continue to work in other parts of China outside of Xinjiang. There has been a backlash. A number of firms, and I won't mention their names because they tend to get quite a tough time in China. When they tried to move their supply chains out of Xinjiang, they were told quite explicitly by the Chinese government they either accepted the situation in Xinjiang and they continued in Xinjiang, otherwise they would be absolutely removed from China, that there would be no evidence that these firms existed for any customer based in China. So these are the tough decisions that firms have to make. But I would argue that we have already Modern Slavery Act and other pieces of legislation, and there's no reason whatsoever we can't have the same black and white list for firms operating in Xinjiang. One of the other arguments we wanted to make was those firms that weren't offering products but were offering platform services like TikTok, when we knew that when we have evidence that the algorithms were biased against the Uyghur community, that we had access to those algorithms, or understood the pressures they were under to ensure that conversations around the Uyghur and their plight weren't removed from their platforms. So the algorithm and data argument is incredibly crucial. Most of our children, our friends and family are using social media platforms. All that information is being harvested. A number of firms that are linked back to Chinese state government are then collecting that data on our movements, on our tastes and our values, and also collating what we think about very important issues on the Uyghur and distorting the information they receive. We also wanted to put pressure on companies that are based over in Hollywood who are incredibly reluctant to tackle the China issue. And we tried to get Walt Disney to come and give evidence. And even though they refused to give evidence, there was a huge amount of debate in the UK Parliament and then in the United States, which has led to them having incredibly difficult conversations with their board. So there's a huge amount of work we can do as parliamentarians on the back of the research that is provided by all of the experts in the room. Fundamentally, the Business Select Committee report is just asking the UK government to apply a one rule for the whole world. And we're asking the government to be absolutely clear that when it is procuring products for the firms that it is working with, that they can also showcase that they aren't at all complicit in Uyghur slave labour. I must say that my report was not accepted by my government, which was a disappointment, but along with Tom, we'll continue to work with government to encourage them to pick up the recommendations. But what it has done has impacted work in the United States, especially import controls legislation that they are trying to put in place at the moment, import controls from Xinjiang, and also influence European governments around the world too. So I'm not going to lose heart. I'm going to continue to campaign, but we have an incredible long journey ahead of us, and I just hope that we can continue to work together over the next few years to make a difference.
Thank you so much to Tom and to Nusrat for those contributions. And we're going to move back to the video link and to Dr. Sophie Richardson, China Director at Human Rights Watch.
Thanks very much. I just want to make sure first that you can hear me. Okay, great, terrific. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to join you. I will briefly praise Joe as well, who's done really extraordinary work in bringing everyone together. I also do want to make sure that we acknowledge the good work that's been done on this issue by the British government, and I would like to give a particular shout out to the UK Embassy in Beijing, which has really, in my view, been second to none in providing analysis on Xinjiang. But also, it's such a pleasure to be here with some of the members of Parliament who have worked so hard to bring these issues not just to the fore, but also to turn them into real actionable policy. Now, you can't hear me. Okay, I'm going to plug in the hopes that you can. Also, on the topic of genocide, crimes against humanity, and how to take things forward, I will just say that I think the world would be a very different place if all governments really fully embraced their obligations under the Genocide Convention. We probably wouldn't need to be doing what we're doing here, but that may be a separate discussion. I wanted to just make some quick observations about the report and the recommendations that it sets out, the Foreign Affairs Select Committee's report, which is a terrific piece of work, and it was an honor to be part of some of those conversations. And just to offer 4 quick thoughts about prevention. The first is that definitions are prevention. I think in that, and what I mean by that is that our conceptualization of atrocities matters. And I think one of the most important steps that could be taken next would be to broaden out the definition and the understanding of what an atrocity is, to explicitly recognize some of the policies that the Chinese government has pursued. When we first started looking at the kinds of diagnostics and indicators, for example, that the UN puts forward for ethnic conflict or atrocities back in 2014 or 2015, in some ways, many of them adequately addressed the situation in Xinjiang, but they didn't quite speak to the kind of discrimination that we were seeing absent mass violence. And I think that, along with broadening out perhaps some of the language in the Genocide Convention itself, could be very interesting projects for this new body to take on. Second, I couldn't agree more that extrication from complicity is prevention. And I mean that primarily in the sense of making sure that UK businesses get out of Xinjiang, since it's not possible for anybody to do adequate human rights due diligence. That we should all be making sure that we're not wearing goods made with Xinjiang cotton, which is a little bit hard to do these days, but it is realistic. We've purged our household of anything that we are concerned about. I think there's also room for positive incentives, both for businesses and for consumers in approaching these supply chain problems with respect to Xinjiang. And, in the sense that we were discussing a moment ago, making lists of perhaps companies that are playing by the rules and that aren't, let's make sure that we hold up the companies that do agree to get out of a situation where forced labor is predominant. Third, I think saving individuals is prevention, obviously. But by that, I mean one area that governments desperately need to address or could definitely benefit from more attention is the situation of Uyghurs who are trying to flee either directly from China or from other countries and who are at risk of being returned. I think there's a lot of room for like-minded governments to coordinate and cooperate to step in and help those people when they turn up in the Middle East, for example, or in West Africa or in Eastern Europe. That there should be consideration amongst governments of opening embassy doors and giving people refuge. Each time this happens, there's a mad scramble to find the nearest UNHCR office and make sure that someone isn't forcibly returned. And it's a real problem, and it happens more often, I think, than people realize. And I think that could be a real contribution in addition to protecting diaspora communities. Last but not least, prosecution is prevention. We obviously believe that no state is above the law, as Ms. Ghani just articulated herself. We think there is real merit in ending the Chinese government's sense of impunity, not just for what's happening in Xinjiang, but for other kinds of human rights crimes as well. And in that sense, we obviously continue to push and hope the UK government will push for an investigation into crimes against humanity that can begin outside the country. It doesn't require access. But we also believe that all other avenues should be exhausted as well, whether it's taking a complaint under the convention to eliminate racial discrimination or pursuing whatever avenues can be cracked open at the ICC. And last but not least, we think there's real merit in pursuing universal jurisdiction cases as well. This has happened now quite recently in Germany with cases against Syrians. And we hope that the UK government will consider that as well. So those are just some thoughts, hopefully useful for discussion, and I will stop there. Thanks.
Informative, and thank you so much. Bit of reverb. Round of applause. Next, we have Dr. Kate Ferguson.
Thank you so much. It's such a privilege to be here with all of you. Again, Joe, what a tremendous job you've done now, but just ongoing. And Hannah, of course. But also just a real privilege to be on this panel, and especially to be speaking alongside Nusrat and Tom, who've just, along with their committees, done such tremendous work, really looking in very practical, focused, realistic ways on the gaps in UK policy. And I think it really provides a roadmap in both of those documents. I commend both of them to you if you haven't read them, or if you have, reread them. And sort of there is the pathway that I really think we can all get behind in a very practical way. I think what I'd like to do is actually zoom out a little bit and just use my short period of time to talk about why this work on atrocity prevention policy reform is so desperately needed. And if we just think about the situation that we are in the world today and the majority of violent crises in the world. You know, we have been talking a lot about Xinjiang today, and that's what this conference is about. We've had references to Afghanistan. Let's also think of Syria. Let's think of the situation in Burma and Myanmar, in Tigray. In all corners of the world, we have these very serious situations of mass violence that are being driven by mass atrocity crimes. They are not the consequences of other situations, you know, armed conflict. It is these dynamics of mass atrocity crimes that are driving these very, very difficult challenges to human security and to global stability. And it's really important that we just take the very basic understanding that atrocity prevention is not the same as conflict prevention, because mass atrocities are not the same as armed conflict. And that might sound obvious to all of us in this room, because of course we've been talking in such incredible detail about the nuances that exist between crimes against humanity and genocide and other forms of human rights abuses. But it is this assumption that atrocities can effectively be prevented by conflict prevention approaches that is the big inhibitor to the big recommendations that have come particularly out of the report that Tom was talking about from the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Now, that's kind of my caveat. The second is really to sort of think about where these crimes therefore then come from. And they have their antecedents in human rights violations and abuses in unequal societies. It is ultimately a challenge about discrimination and injustice and inequality and political grievances. And again, while they have some commonalities in the root causes of armed conflict, they are very often drivers that are not necessarily covered by sort of common approaches to conflict prevention. The other thing we really need to accept, which I think has been well proved and established in today's conversations, is that genocide and crimes against humanity are intentional acts. They are not somehow accidental. They are rational, awful and appalling, but they are rational. Perpetrators benefit by committing them. And again, the drivers of those perpetrators are distinct from what causes armed conflict. And so if we can accept this fact that the root causes of crimes against humanity and of genocide are different to the root causes of war, then we can accept that we need to have different approaches to that challenge. And we really need to then bring together this acceptance that crimes against humanity and genocide, far from being never again, are in fact becoming more common. They are not something that is a problem of a past era. They are becoming more frequent, and they will define not just this political era, but the future one. As the consequences of climate change worsen, metastasize, as the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic really become kind of more worked out, the economic crisis that will kind of continue to spiral as a result of this really sort of global phenomenon, we will see more of these kinds of crises. And at the moment, our approaches to conflict don't work. And so it is particularly sort of those gaps that, the organization I work for, Protection Approaches, and also sort of the committees in response to the terrible crimes going on in Xinjiang, those are the gaps that we are looking at. And in Xinjiang, we have the example of a very blatant campaign of mass atrocity crimes that is taking place outside of an armed conflict situation. It is very blatant, but it is not in that sense unique. But it really holds up and exposes in very, very dramatic fashion the gaps in UK policy to such situations. And so despite the fact that atrocity crimes are not just a very serious challenge, but a growing one, and besides the fact that we can accept that mass atrocity crimes come from a different place to armed conflict, the implementation of UK atrocity prevention, such as it is one, conflated within that conflict strategy, but two, the prevention bit of that thinking, and more specifically what is sort of in a policy wonk way often called foresight policy making, which is sort of scenario planning. You're thinking about what could happen in the future and how you can prevent further crises. has been, at least in my analysis of sort of the last 20, 30 years of UK foreign policy, sort of right back to the 1990s and responses to what happened in Bosnia, has been absent from almost every single stage of UK policy making. So in the sort of early stages, missing the warning signs, in the medium stages when you can see that something's going to happen, and then at the point of crisis. And so those are those gaps that I think that both the Foreign Affairs Select Committee report and Nusrat's report really do such an excellent job at holding up to. And that's why we need to have an overarching national strategy on atrocity prevention, because there are contributions, as Sophie just said, that can be made from all sorts of arenas, whether it is through prosecution, whether it's through refugee policy, education policy, our procurement policy, our diplomacy. And Tom is completely right that you need to have policy leads in all of those areas. I won't go into my sort of wish list, my recommendations, because I honestly think the Foreign Affairs Select Committee has done such a tremendous job of it. But if you need further lists of recommendations, I have many. I'll stop there, but thank you so much.
We were discussing earlier about who's going to hit the target on one of your wish lists. So maybe just maybe, Stephen Kinnock will get one of those atrocity prevention things on your wish list.
Well,
Be interested to hear.
No pressure there. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Thanks so much for the invitation to come today. I'd also like to pay tribute to Joe for the amazing work that you've done, and to colleagues from the Conservative benches who've spoken today, because they've actually shown a lot of courage as well, not just in terms of courage in the face of the Chinese Communist Party, but also in the face of some considerable pressure they've been under from their own government benches, and they're far too modest to talk about that themselves, so I'll do it for them. And it's been a real pleasure to work across the House on these issues, because the fact is that when we're dealing with issues that go right to the heart of our humanity and our values and what it means to actually stand up for what you believe in, narrow party political partisan point scoring just doesn't work, doesn't count, should be completely rejected. And that's what I think we've done in terms of working with those brave colleagues from the Conservative benches who have actually stood up for their principles and done the right thing. And I suppose that's what I wanted to focus my comments on here, because what we've heard so far sets out very, very clearly what it is that needs to be done. We know that we need an atrocity prevention strategy. We know that we need a due diligence in supply chains strategy. We know that we need legislation to back it up. We know that all of that legislation needs real teeth and follow-up. We know that there should be a full diplomatic and political boycott of the Winter Olympics in Beijing. We know that there should be proper sanctioning of all those that need to be sanctioned. Why is it that Chen Guangguo has not been sanctioned? We know that there should have been a genocide amendment to the trade bill. We know that the government should have supported Parliament in its declaration of genocide and the motion that Nuz just read out. Why are none of those things happening? And I think that that's what we fundamentally need to debate, because without the political leadership, we can have as many good ideas and strategies and roadmaps as we want, but it has to be converted into legislation. It has to be converted into policy. It has to be converted into a foreign policy which doesn't have a China strategy-shaped hole at the middle of it. And the fundamental challenge that we're facing is that we have a government that is still stuck in the golden era. The golden era has completely failed. The golden era was, as everybody here will know, about opening up to China in terms of trade and investment, and there would somehow be some kind of alignment then with the international rules-based order and some of the behaviors, not necessarily the value or the culture in any way, shape or form, but the behaviors that we need to see so that the world doesn't descend into the law of the jungle. None of that has happened. The opposite has happened, and we have ended up being played. So the question is whether the British government is actually going to have an honest conversation with itself and support all of the actions and roadmaps and plans that have been set out here today and countless times in parliamentary debates, in urgent questions, in statements to ministers, in written questions, in letters to ministers. It's not happening. There's a real concern for me that this is about our national interest, not about party political point scoring. It genuinely isn't. I want to see a British government that is united and strong and consistent. Because when you are dealing with ruthless authoritarian regimes, such as the one we see in China, they will exploit inconsistency and weakness and disunity, and they will respect strength and consistency. And the challenge that we have is we see the divisions in the Conservative benches. We see the fact that we almost had enough Conservative rebels to pass the genocide amendment to the trade bill, in spite of very, very tough screw tightening by government whips. All of that is noted by Beijing, and that division will be exploited. So I suppose my final comment would be that we need a proper China strategy. It has to be backed up with strength and consistency. It means that Number 10 Downing Street and the Treasury need to reject the Golden Era strategy and move into where we are now in 2021. And I hope that through really important conferences and initiatives like this, Parliament reconvenes on Monday. Of course, the central focus is going to be on Afghanistan for very important and understandable reasons. But it's so important that we continue to work together, that we continue to press for the leadership that we so desperately need to see on the international stage. And I hope that we will, for example, get the government to finally commit to taking forward some of the excellent recommendations in the reports we've heard about before, but many other big political decisions that need to be made, for example, the diplomatic and political boycott of the Beijing Winter Olympics, which the Labour Party is calling for. So I hope that will give us something to debate going forward, and I really do look forward to questions and to a discussion about some of these vitally important issues. Thank you very much. 56 seconds.
Thank you so much to all of our panellists for their contributions. Before we open up to questions on the floor, I was wondering if any of the panellists have any reply or comment to what any of their co-speakers have said, or if you would like to say anything in addition, raise your hand if you would. If not, yes?
It's going to be one of those panels where I think we're going to be agreeing with each other for the rest of this violently. But I owe a lot to my colleagues, because leading a rebellion is incredibly difficult. So having colleagues sticking with us for so many months was key. One of the interesting points that you made, Chair, was as soon as the government knows that there is a risk of a genocide, that they are in violation. But considering that we know the United Nations is broken because it's already handcuffed by China, who are they going to be held? Who's going to be holding them to account? And this is part of the problem with large institutions now. The amount of hold that China has in all of the major institutions means that nobody is going to be holding any government to account in any time soon. So how is that going to change?
I'm actually talking about this tomorrow.
But just a little précis of what I might be saying is the Genocide Convention, the obligations on the Genocide Convention are owed by all state parties to that convention, to all state parties. And that's not only the obligation not to commit genocide, but the obligation to prevent genocide. And the Gambia-Myanmar case is a really important case in the International Court of Justice, because it demonstrates that a state that is not geographically linked to a state where an alleged genocide is being committed can and will, provided that the other party hasn't submitted a reservation to the Genocide Convention, which in China's case it has, bring a case to the International Court of Justice. A state could bring a case, in theory, against the United Kingdom for its failure to prevent genocide, depending on the circumstances and the facts on the ground. So, how can the UK be held account? Well, international community, it's the states' obligations, they can hold each other to account. The problem is the will. And I think Shona Jolly brought this up earlier. There is a distinct lack of will from states to use the legal accountability mechanisms available to them in order to hold each other to account for failure to comply with their obligations under international conventions. And it's one of the weaknesses of international law, and it's well recognised. It's a consent-based system. But there is that possibility, in the same way that the UK could institute a complaint against China before the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. It really is up to states. But then if we bring it back to the UK and inside the UK and what the UK might be doing, and thank you so much for bringing up Parliament's declaration of recognition that it constitutes genocide. What I would be interested to know from the parliamentarians is what the next steps you think should be for the government and how, in light of that declaration. Because now there is a recognition by Parliament that certainly the obligation to take steps to prevent is triggered, whether or not the UK might be found responsible in law, legally responsible, for failure to meet that obligation. So what should the concrete next steps be for government?
I think one of the reasons that we were moving the genocide amendment on the trade bill and also having the debate and the support for the genocide amendment on the floor of the House was to close or narrow the space that government has in falling back on the arguments that it used over the 2 years we were trying to deal with the genocide amendment, whether they're relying on a credible court to determine genocide or whether they're waiting for UN bodies or any third state to take action. We are doing everything that we can to try and make government feel that the only move they can make is to say that we are now deeply uncomfortable, we are going to have to start triggering certain international obligations because this is proving to be incredibly difficult domestically. And we're also hoping, because as Conservative MPs who want to give our government space to do the right thing, is that they can also say to countries like China, we are now in a very tough position. We are losing we are losing arguments, we are losing space, we're going to have to make these moves that are coming our way. And that's why Tom's report is incredibly important, along with mine, because we're showcasing to government where legislation is already failing, not only the British customer, but also British firms when it comes to Xinjiang. So when they are implementing national law, we can showcase how it doesn't at all impact on China. So maybe it'll give them the extra confidence they need to ensure that legislative hole is filled. We're doing, I think Tom and I are just doing the work that government officials would be doing and should be doing if the departments are minded to do so. But I'll let Tom cover what's happening in the Foreign Office when it comes to his report.
And with that, actually, Tom, I have a question for you. You raised in your remarks the merger of the Foreign Office and DFID and how that is actually could have a positive impact with respect to atrocity prevention. And I was just wondering if you might be able to expand on that point a bit more. You're on mute.
It shouldn't be. Shouldn't be. Oh, there we go. I'm on echo. Okay. Sorry, there's an extraordinary echo. This has been inspiring for the very reason that Nuz mentioned at the beginning, which is that many of us are saying similar points, but from different angles. And I should say that the work of the Foreign Office on this has not been zero, and they have certainly made some quite significant areas of progress in recent years. So I wouldn't wish this to be a sort of government bashing session. It certainly shouldn't be. I would like to see more political direction on this, and I would like to see more powerful ministerial interest. But what is quite inspiring is that if you look at the work of Caroline Wilson, for example, our ambassador in Beijing, you see the work of somebody who is extremely committed to this on a personal level and has begun reporting very interestingly and very powerfully on areas where we have some work, I think would be a polite way of putting it. And so I think that we should be supportive of that. I do still think, however, that the recommendations that we made about greater cross-government capability is still something that is difficult. And I understand why governments find it difficult, because it's so much easier to work within a system rather than across one. But this is where, you know, the DFID FCDO tie-up, or rather DFID FCO tie-up to the FCDO, is so important and demonstrates the way in which really good best practice should be able to be done, which is that many different organizations feed into different ministries, whether they are chambers of commerce, whether they are legal exchanges, universities, through education department, and so on. And building these together and looking at the way that the FCO and DFID have worked into one. I'm not suggesting, by the way, that we merged the Department for Education with the FCO, but but looking at the ways in which people cooperate, I think is a very powerful message, not just for our future ability to act, but actually also to other governments and other peoples around the world to see whether we can encourage cooperation as well.
Fundamental decision. Wow, the echoes everywhere. It's not. I'm just trying to copy Tom as always. There's a fundamental decision that needs to be made as to whether we just are going to completely give up on the UN route for many of the reasons that have just been mentioned. Clearly, what's happened with Myanmar is an example that we have to look at, which says, well, perhaps this is, I mean, it shows that it's possible, but clearly it's a completely different situation when it comes to China. But once that strategic decision has been made that we're not going to pursue the UN route, and I know I don't want to preempt what we're going to be talking about in the next session, then you need the government, because your question was what should the government be doing next? That fork in the road needs to come, and then the government has to decide, does it want to pursue other plurilateral routes, creating alliances with other countries, looking at using our own courts, which was, of course, the whole purpose of the Genocide Amendment. I think this is sort of a kind of a decision tree there, which is if we're not going to go down the UN route, which I think would be deeply regrettable, but we also have to recognize what's happening with the veto-wielding power of China and Russia, then you have to commit to another strategy. The problem is I don't see any evidence that the government is recognizing that there's this fork in the road and that they want to go down the other fork. But if they do want to go down that other fork, there are many, many options at their disposal. But they have to first of all make that in principle decision and demonstrate that they have the political will to do so.
Can I just come in on that? Don't know. Yeah, I just on that question of sort of the extent to which the UN system is broken, of course it is, and the Security Council has been so fraught on issues of mass atrocity for really some years now. But we also now have a situation where the United States is signalled in the strongest possible, and I would say devastating way, a change in its indication of how it wants to play a role in the world when it comes to American foreign policy. And that is said with no comment on the question of the forever wars and the presence in Afghanistan in the first place, but the pulling out in such a dramatic fashion and of leaving so many people at acute and urgent risk of atrocities really demonstrates an extraordinary lack of atrocity prevention thinking. But more than that, if we can say that, it means that we now have a state of play in international relations where there is this vacuum and this question, where neither the Security Council is working on issues of mass atrocity, and the US has signalled a very different position, but we're not quite sure what that means. And, while we can take the Biden administration at its word that it no longer wants to play such a kind of role in military endeavours, Clearly, atrocity prevention was not at the heart of its decision this summer, or it would have been done very, very differently. And so that actually creates an opportunity, as well as a kind of crisis in international relations, for states like the United Kingdom. You know, the UK sits on the Security Council, and however broken it is, that still counts for something in my eyes. And also for medium powers that sort of wish to help contribute to a world where mass atrocities are less likely. Now, those opportunities are not going to be realized very quickly, but it does mean that we are in a real kind of, I think, tectonic shift in international relations and how we respond to mass atrocities, and also bearing in mind my previous remarks that these awful situations are only going to sort of become more common. And so then to something much more concrete, we have the opportunity in implementing the Prime Minister's integrated review on international policy, you know, which was touted as the biggest, widest, most comprehensive review of UK international policy since the Cold War. And within that strategic document, and I agree that there is a China-shaped hole in that strategy, but there is a very clear commitment to prioritise atrocity prevention. Now, if that can be built out, and if it can be built out along the lines of which, you know, Tom was just, you know, so clearly setting out, then we might be getting somewhere, and then we might also be able to sort of balance that exact challenge, Stephen, that you were just talking about, sort of if the UN system is too difficult at the moment, the UK has an obligation to pursue a sort of state-led approach.
Something in there. I'm afraid I'm going to disagree. There's a disagreement on the panel. I disagree that there's a fork. I don't think it's either the United Nations and the international community or the United Kingdom. I think they go together. And I'm sorry, I'm going to be quite legalistic, I'm a lawyer, but the International Court of Justice has recognised that each and every state with the capacity to influence must do all it can. And it has recognised that that capacity to influence will differ according to the state, whether it's economic power, military, geographic. But it also said, quite importantly, that whether or not each steps must be taken no matter how small, because together and collectively they might achieve the outcome of preventing the genocide. And ultimately, the position we want to be in is that no genocide is committed. So I'm afraid I disagree there's a fork in the road. I think it's the decision that is a decision to take, and it's, when you're thinking, it shouldn't be either the UN does this, and I know that's the Foreign Secretary's position, that it's up to the UN Human Rights Commissioner to go in and to investigate. It's actually not an either-or situation. It's both at the same time, the UK and the UK government. So it's implementing this legislation that was recommended at the same time as pushing in the Human Rights Council, in the UN Security Council for developments. So I'm sorry for that disagreement.
Definitely take... Sorry.
Sophie, please. Sorry, Sophie, you're on mute. Hang on.
Just to comment on a couple of the points that have gotten made, at the risk of beating some metaphors to death here, not only do I not think there's a fork, but I also think that to make the UN mechanisms that should respond to the Xinjiang crisis respond to it is to help salvage the UN human rights system. It's absolutely true that the Chinese government has encroached on that system significantly. And it's very clear that if democracies don't band together to salvage that system, we're all worse off. And I mean that for issues that don't necessarily pertain to China. So I think that really it's essential to pursue avenues there. But also to pick up on the point about a China strategy, I do think we're mercifully not quite in the golden era anymore, because I think it would have not happened in that era that, British diplomats would have been in the lead on joint statements about Xinjiang at the Human Rights Council or at the Third Committee. That said, why not set an exemplar in that you could develop a China strategy. By the way, I don't think any government has a China strategy, or at least not a good one as far as human rights are concerned. Why not try to hammer out, perhaps in conjunction with your own colleagues who work on education or business, what that strategy ought to look like and present it to the government? We've been encouraging a number of states to do just this. I think at this point, I'm not wildly optimistic about what the White House may ultimately offer up. But I think part of what's powerful, both about Tom's and Nos's reports, is that they really do draw from a number of different perspectives to speak to a broad variety of issues. And so I think there's much to be said for trying to present a China strategy rather than waiting for a government to generate one. So just a few thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Now I have the reverb. Is there anything else our panelists would like to say before I open up to questions from the floor? No? Okay, anyone have any questions? Yes, Sidak has a question. We'll take two. We'll take yours and then your question. Mic is on its way.
Thank you. Easy question, straightforward one for anyone who knows. What are the inhibitions inside the British state and the machinery of the state towards a more robust inhibition or prevention agenda, condemnation agenda in the Xinjiang space on that issue? What's preventing it? Or what are the arguments?
Is that right? Yep. Yep, thank you. Just wanted to say a quick but very large thank you to Nusrat GHANI for all her outstanding work. Thank you. Actually, I like the previous question slightly more than what I was going to ask, but mine is a small addendum to that. I enjoyed Stephen Kinnock's list of rhetorical questions, and I wanted to throw back the one about Chen Quanguo. Why hasn't he actually been sanctioned yet?
To take question number one first.
I can try taking question one. I think Tom will probably add some texture as well from his point of view, chairing his select committee. I suspect that one of the practical realities of dealing with Xinjiang, and this is no excuse, is that the products that come out of Xinjiang are just everywhere. So where do you start? And which industries do you clamp down on? Which businesses do you ask to move where? And when you look at simple things such as cotton, it's incredibly difficult to try and scope out what one strategy would be. So I can understand why the complication and the horror of the size of not just the prison camps, but how all of that slave labour is just fed through everything that we consume. It's incredibly difficult. And then you're met by a state that either denies you access or denies anything is taking place. So I can just understand sort of, people thinking, where do we begin if we begin to unpick this? And how do we unpick this without damaging our political relations? And how do we unpick this without damaging UK businesses as well? I'm not saying that's what's happening, but I can understand that's what's taking place. When I instigated the Select Committee report, one of my motivations was that we are doing so much work on environmental standards and forcing companies to showcase their impact on the environment that we would have thought was, the companies wouldn't be able to do that. So we're going down so hard on the environment, yet we're not using the same rules or the same sort of nudge behaviour when it comes to businesses dealing with absolute slave labour, where there's no denying what's taking place in Xinjiang. And what was also apparent when the businesses came forward is some of them were struggling to do the right thing. They weren't all in Xinjiang to try and cut a major margin, but they just didn't know how to do it differently or how to do it and still have access to the Chinese consumer. So there's all those difficulties we have to deal with as well. And I also believe fundamentally there is a problem within politics too. How do we deal with an issue like genocide, which is clear cut, but we're dealing with a country like China when we have its investments into our major infrastructure in the UK, to academic institutions, to everything else that enables his country to function. How do we start unpicking this, and how many greater enemies can one make? Which is why we do need to sit down and understand about who we are as a country and how we think we are going to be exporting our values and not be consumed by China's values going forward when it comes to an issue that is so binary as genocide. But I do not doubt that we've had a period of time where everyone thought that China was going to open up to the West and maybe absorb some of our values. And then we've had time taken up with other policies, whether it's Brexit or to COVID, and maybe governments haven't had time to think about who they wish to be and the legacies they wish to leave behind for future governments and for future generations as well.
Yeah, can I add a word to that? Yeah. I mean, I absolutely agree with what Nusrat said there, and I suppose if you had to just find a few words to answer your question in as brief and as pithy way as possible, I would say it's about fear, and it's about isolation, and it's about overdependence. And the British government looks at what China's done to Australia, and they say, we don't really fancy that. We've become massively overdependent on Chinese investment. I mean, China owns 33% of Hinkley Point. I mean, it's just insane to be allowing that kind of thing to happen, and that's just the tip of the iceberg, of course. When you look across all of our national strategic assets, you find Chinese investment in so many of them, and you also look at Chinese-backed companies now looking to buy semiconductors, imagination technologies, you name it, they're there. And it's about isolation, because the reality is, and as Kate mentioned, the fallout from Afghanistan, one of the things that's absolutely crystal clear is the United Kingdom is more isolated than it has been at any time since the Second World War. We have spent the last 5 to 6 years burning bridges with our democratic European partners. We put all of our eggs into the American basket, and look where that's got us. So fear, isolation, overdependence, all connected to each other, because the more isolated you are, the more scared you are. And so that feeds into the fundamental weaknesses, structural weaknesses in the government's approach to China. And the question about Chen Quanguo is all connected to that. I think, I don't have the intelligence in front of me about what decisions were made, why you wouldn't sanction Chen Quanguo, who is the architect, the orchestrator of what's been happening in Xinjiang. But I can only assume it's connected to my answer to the first question.
Can I quickly add to that? Just to give a different perspective, not in contradiction, I agree with everything that's just been said, but I do think that there's a kind of bureaucratic way of looking at this challenge too. The FCDO, and before it the FCO, has been in flux for such a long time, cut into a smaller entity, resources being squished, the diplomatic corps being narrowed. And I do think that has had a consequence. We're also seeing in kind of attitudes towards China in Whitehall and in the embassies is the consequences of a long-term problem and absence. We've been asking in the last year or so how many people in the China embassy and the China desk have had training on atrocity prevention. We kind of know the answer to that because they've only just introduced a kind of very small module, and I'm not sure if it's been rolled out to China yet. But the absence of that thinking within the bureaucratic structures, those people that are doing the hard work and trying their best, who are providing the analysis and the recommendations to ministers, don't have the systems within which to kind of function. Another longer term problem is that in the UK, we have really for a very, very long time responded to humanitarian and human rights crises with firefighting rather than doing the hard political work. And again, that comes back to the problem of undermining the strength of the British Foreign Office. And it's very hard to firefight with respect to Xinjiang. There aren't many options for the UK or for anyone there. So that's a problem. And then more broadly, with respect to that lack of that prevention thinking in UK foreign policy, it's a lack of the structures. And it's been very difficult to find those areas for creative thinking, strategic thinking, and prevention thinking, and I'm by no means the only person saying that about British foreign policy, but actually one of the things that we're really seeing in conversations about the future of UK atrocity prevention, I think, are some of the most exciting questions and conversations about the future of UK foreign policy, or the possibilities for it, actually. Thank you.
I was going to ask Tom TUGENDHAT if he had anything to say to follow on from you, but I think we've lost him.
He's just messaged me. He's got to dash. I think it's so between this and Afghanistan, he doesn't have a huge amount of time. But he sends his apologies. Joe, he did just message me. Thank you.
Yeah. Are there any other questions? Oh, Sophie. Sorry. Thank you. Oh, Sophie, you're on mute.
I think it's like this. Somehow the speaker has to be moved to her.
Hi. I just wanted to add to Stephen's list the problem of greed. I have lost whole weeks of my life in the last year or two talking to UK-based companies who call wanting briefings on issues like human rights due diligence and supply chain problems and forced labor in Xinjiang. And it's very clear very quickly that I'm not actually telling them much they don't already know. What they want is some sort of blessing to keep going ahead as they are without changing gears. They don't want to have to pull out. They don't want to have to relocate their supply chains. They don't want to have to lose out on money. And I have to say, I don't understand why these companies call. Because all they do is put themselves more in our line of sight for having these, I think, quite perverse impulses to look for that absolution. But they're certainly not going to get it from us. I think it's just another hard choice that governments have to make. Are they willing to, really require businesses to leave? Are there ways to create incentives for them? And I think that's a major issue for any government, but I wouldn't underestimate the power of greed in this discussion and potential solutions to it. Thanks.
Thank you, Sophie. I'm terribly sorry. I know there are some hands raised, but I'm afraid we have come to the end of our time for this panel, and we're flowing straight into Roundtable 3 on assessing avenues for UN engagement on the atrocities against the Uyghurs. So can I ask you all to give our panelists a round of applause.